The sun over Greenfield was just peeking over the hills when Lucy Hart finished getting ready for her first day at the prestigious St. Ignatius Preparatory School. Her trembling hands adjusted the uniform tie as her father, Mr. James Hart, watched proudly from the doorway. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked in that calm voice that always soothed Lucy. "I think so, Dad," she replied, though a knot tightened in her stomach. The scholarship she'd earned was an opportunity few from her small town of Millbrook could even dream of. Mr. Hart had insisted on driving her himself in his old pickup truck, even though Lucy feared it would only make her stand out more, and not in the way she wanted. The Hart family farm was modest but prosperous. The land provided enough to live with dignity, though without luxuries. Mr. Hart always said true wealth lay in character, not in wallets. "Remember who you are and where you come from," he'd tell Lucy, "and no one can make you feel less." Those words echoed in her mind as the truck stopped in front of St. Ignatius's imposing colonial facade. Students arrived in luxury cars, some with chauffeurs. Curious glances quickly landed on the worn-out Ford that stood out among the Mercedes and BMWs dominating the parking lot. "I'll pick you up at 3, sweetheart," Mr. Hart said with a smile that barely hid his concern. Lucy nodded, took a deep breath and stepped through the doors into what would be her new world. The first class passed without incident, but it was during recess that everything changed. In the central courtyard, a group of students surrounded. A girl with perfectly straight hair and an impeccable uniform. Victoria Montgomery, daughter of one of the region's most influential businessmen, ruled St. Ignatius as if the school belonged to her. "Who's the new girl?" Victoria asked when she noticed Lucy sitting alone on a bench. "Her name's Lucy Hart," said Sebastian, one of her loyal followers. "She's from some town. I think she's here on scholarship." Victoria smirked and strode toward Lucy, her entourage in tow. "Hey, you must be the new girl," she said with false sweetness. "Is it true you're from, what's it called, Millbrook?" Lucy looked up, trying not to show discomfort. "Yeah, that's right." "How interesting," Victoria exclaimed. "What does your family do there? They must be pretty important for you to end up at St. Ignatius." The condescension in her tone wasn't lost on Lucy, but she chose to answer honestly. "My dad's a farmer. We have land where we grow corn and beans, mostly." Muffled laughter followed. Victoria arched an eyebrow, as if confirming her suspicions. "Oh, how cute! The farmer's daughter," she said, stressing farmer, like it was an insult. "Well, welcome to St. Ignatius. Hope you can fit in." The venom in her words was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Lucy became Victoria's favorite target. Her shoes, though clean, weren't name brand. Her accent betrayed her rural roots. Even the way she held her utensils in the cafeteria drew whispered mockery. Things worsened when Mrs. Carter announced a major project for the cultural festival. Students were to create a presentation on American traditions, and Lucy saw her chance. She knew traditions firsthand, not from books or documentaries like many of her classmates. For weeks she worked on a presentation about harvest festivals in Millbrook. She'd gathered photos, interviewed elders, and even prepared samples of traditional food. It was her chance to show that her roots weren't a source of shame but pride. 2 days before the festival, Lucy left her presentation saved in the computer lab while she attended gym class. When she returned, all her files were gone. Hours of work lost. In their place was a note: "Country things should stay in the country. VM." That night, Lucy cried like she hadn't since she was a child. Mr. Hart sat beside her on the bed. "Dad, I can't go back there," she sobbed. "They hate me for who I am, for being your daughter." Mr. Hart took her hands in his, calloused from work but incredibly gentle. "Listen to me, Lucy. Never, ever be ashamed of who you are or where you come from. What that girl and her friends don't understand is that real dignity doesn't come from money or last names. But she has everything, Dad. Her family basically funds the school with donations. The teachers won't dare cross her." Mr. Hart fell silent for a moment, as if weighing something important. "Life has funny ways of teaching lessons, sweetheart. Sometimes things aren't what they seem. Promise me you won't give up, that you'll keep your head high." There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty Lucy didn't fully understand. Still, she nodded. She'd trust her father, like she always had. The day of the cultural festival arrived, and with it, the moment Victoria had been waiting for. During Lucy's presentation, improvised after losing her original work, Victoria and her friends made sure to whisper loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think she knows St. Ignatius isn't a barn?" Victoria quipped, sparking giggles. Mrs. Carter, who'd clearly heard, simply cleared her throat and carried on. The auditorium was packed with students' families, including Victoria's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, in their expensive suits and air of importance. When it was Victoria's turn to present her project on Spanish influence in colonial American architecture, she name-dropped historic properties her family owned, including a boutique hotel in Willow Creek, held for generations. Then the auditorium doors swung open, and a commanding figure appeared. A sudden silence fell as Alexander Pierce crossed the threshold. Tall, distinguished, and sharp-eyed, he wore an understated but clearly expensive suit. No one expected his presence, least of all the Montgomerys, whose faces paled instantly. Alexander Pierce was a legend in American business. Owner of Pierce Group, a conglomerate spanning tech agriculture to luxury real estate, he rarely made public appearances. His philosophy of staying in the shadows while his businesses thrived had earned him the nickname the Ghost of Greenfield in corporate circles. Principal Harris interrupted the presentation to greet him. "Mr. Pierce, what an unexpected honor. We didn't know you'd be joining us." Alexander smiled slightly. "Apologies for the interruption, Principal. I just learned of this event and wanted to stop by. I have a vested interest in our youth's education." The flustered principal escorted him to the VIP seats, right in front of the Montgomerys. Mr. Montgomery stood, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Alexander, what a surprise." "Howard," Alexander replied coolly. The tension between them was palpable. Victoria on stage froze mid-sentence. The arrival of Alexander Pierce had stolen the spotlight she'd fought so hard to claim. Here's the continuation, adhering strictly to the original text while maximizing character count within the output limit. "Please continue, Miss Montgomery," Principal Harris urged, but Victoria's confidence had shattered. Her voice wavered as she stumbled through the remainder of her presentation, her eyes darting between Alexander Pierce and her parents, who now sat rigidly in their seats, their earlier smugness replaced by barely concealed dread. Meanwhile, Lucy noticed something peculiar. Mr. Hart had slipped into the auditorium unnoticed and taken a seat in the back row. Stranger still, he occasionally exchanged knowing glances with Alexander, silent communication between two men who shared a history deeper than anyone in that room could have guessed. When Victoria finished, the applause was tepid, a stark contrast to the thunderous approval she'd grown accustomed to. Principal Harris announced a short intermission before resuming the program. Seizing the moment, Victoria, still reeling from the disruption, decided to deliver a final blow. "Before we continue," she announced loudly, hijacking the room's attention, "I'd like to share something fascinating with all of you." Mrs. Carter tried to intervene, but Victoria plowed ahead. "We've heard about various American traditions today, some quite rustic," she said, staring pointedly at Lucy. "It's amusing how some people force themselves into environments they clearly don't belong in." An uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. Lucy's cheeks burned. "For example," Victoria continued, malice dripping from her words. "Did you know we have someone here whose father's probably never set foot in a theater? Someone who'd mistake a salad fork for a seafood fork?" "Miss Montgomery, that's enough, Principal C." Harris finally cut in, but the damage was done. Snickers and pitying glances shot toward Lucy, who wished the floor would swallow her whole. Mr. Hart from his seat clenched his fists, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. Then Alexander Pierce stood. His voice, quiet but razor-sharp, silenced the room. "If I may," and he said, "I believe I have something to add to this. Discussion about heritage and belonging." Every eye locked onto him. The Montgomerys looked ready to bolt. 20 years ago, Alexander began, "I decided the best. Way to oversee my businesses was to stay close, but invisible. I entrusted my properties to people whose worth wasn't measured by their last name, but by their integrity. Howard Montgomery loosened his collar, suddenly suffocating in his own guilt. One of those people, Alexander continued, gesturing to the back of the room, is James Hart. Collective gasp erupted. Lucy whipped her head toward her father, stunned. Mr. Hart has been my right hand for 2 decades. He manages not only his own land in Millbrook, but several of my most valuable holdings, including the Willow Creek boutique hotel the Montgomerys love bragging about. Victoria turned ghostly pale, her parents shrinking under the weight of the revelation. In fact, Alexander added, zeroing in on Howard, it's time we clarified your arrangement, Howard. You operate some of my urban properties. You don't own them, you never have. The silence was deafening. Victoria, still on stage, looked like she'd been slapped. The Montgomerys work for me, Alexander stated coldly. Just as James Hart does. The difference? James never pretended to be something he's not. His honesty is why I trust him more than anyone. Principal Harris, sweating, tried salvaging the situation. Perhaps we should... One more thing, Alexander interrupted, turning to Lucy. Miss Hart, I understand your original project was lost. Lucy nodded, speechless. I'd like you to present it properly. Your father's told me about your talent. I'm sure we'd all prefer authentic Millbrook traditions from someone who lives them, not just studies them from a distance. The principal, now fully aware of who held real power in the room, eagerly agreed. Of course, Lucy. Could you prepare your original presentation for tomorrow? We'll host a special session. Mr. Hart finally approached the stage, standing beside Lucy with quiet pride. She stared at him, struggling to process everything. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Because I wanted you to value what truly matters, sweetheart. He murmured back. Money and power are tools, not definitions of who we are. Alexander joined them, resting a hand on Mr. Hart's shoulder. Your father's the wisest man I know, Lucy. He's kept his boots on the ground, while others blinded themselves with wealth they didn't even own. His gaze flicked to the Montgomerys, who were already slinking toward the exit, a shattered Victoria trailing behind. That night, back at the modest Hart family home in Millbrook, Lucy finally learned the full truth. Mr. Hart and Alexander Pierce had grown up together in the same small town. While Alexander had left to pursue education and build his fortune, James had chosen to stay and work the land he loved. When Alexander returned as a successful businessman, he'd offered his childhood friend the opportunity to oversee his properties. We could have moved to some mansion in the city, Mr. Hart explained as they sat at their weathered kitchen table, the smell of fresh cornbread filling the air. But why? We've got everything we need right here. The land provides, we've got true friends, and now you're getting the education your mother always dreamed for you. Lucy thought about Victoria, how her entire identity had been built on lies about properties and wealth that never truly belonged to her family. Tomorrow's going to be hard for her, Lucy said quietly. Her whole world just collapsed. Mr. Hart smiled at his daughter's compassion. That proves I raised you right. Revenge doesn't bring peace, only more pain. Victoria's learning a hard lesson, but a necessary one. The next day at St. Ignatius, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Students who'd once followed Victoria like shadows now clamored for Lucy's attention. Teachers, including Mrs. Carter, fell over themselves praising James Hart's daughter, Alexander Pierce's right-hand man. Victoria arrived late, eyes red-rimmed, head bowed. Her entourage had vanished, and for the first time she experienced what it meant to be alone in hostile territory. The auditorium overflowed for Lucy's special presentation. News of yesterday's revelations had spread like wildfire through Greenfield. Alexander Pierce himself occupied the front row beside Mr. Hart, both wearing identical expressions of paternal pride. Lucy had spent all night reconstructing her presentation, but something fundamental had changed in her. She no longer felt the need to impress anyone or fear judgment. Now she understood her roots held value far beyond what anyone at this school could appreciate. With clear, confident voice, Lucy shared Millbrook's traditions, the seed blessing ceremonies before planting, the harvest dances, generations-old recipes passed down through families. She showed photos of farmers working the land with dignity, of families sharing whatever they had, whether little or much. In Millbrook, Lucy concluded, we measure a person's wealth not by what they own, but by what they're willing to share. Not by how they look, but by how they treat others, and most of all by the honesty they live with every single day. The applause was thunderous. Even Principal Harris, who'd barely acknowledged Lucy before, rose to congratulate her effusively. Among the crowd, Lucy spotted Victoria sitting alone in the back row, her face a mask of shame and confusion, like someone lost in a world she no longer recognized. When the presentation ended, Alexander announced he'd establish a foundation to fund scholarships for rural students, with its first project being the renovation of Millbrook's elementary school. The news was met with enthusiasm, especially from Principal Harris, who'd suddenly developed a keen interest in rural education. During the reception afterward, Lucy found herself surrounded by classmates, suddenly eager to know her, teachers praising her brilliant mind, and parents angling for connections with the Hart-Pierce family, as some were already calling them, despite no actual relation. Overwhelmed by the hypocrisy, Lucy slipped out to the school's back garden for air. To her surprise, she found Victoria sitting alone on a bench, staring blankly at the horizon. Lucy hesitated, then sat beside her. They remained silent for a long moment. My parents have been lying to me my whole life, Victoria finally said, voice cracking. Last night I found out we're practically bankrupt. They've been living on credit, spending money we don't have, going into debt to keep up appearances. Lucy didn't know how to respond. Never could she have imagined the haughty Victoria Montgomery opening up like this. The worst part, Victoria continued, is now I understand why Dad always changed the subject when I asked about our properties. It was all a lie. I'm sorry, Lucy said sincerely. Victoria turned to her with something between disbelief and admiration. You're sorry? After how I treated you? After I humiliated you, deleted your project? You actually feel bad for me? It's not pity, Lucy explained. It's empathy. It must be terrible learning your family isn't what you believed. Victoria gave a bitter laugh. You know what's most ironic? I look down on you for being the farmer's daughter, when your father's 1,000 times more respected and honest than mine. I mocked your roots when mine were built on sand. Another thoughtful silence settled between them. From inside, laughter and chatter from the reception drifted out, a world from which both girls suddenly felt disconnected. What will you do now? Lucy finally asked. Victoria sighed. I don't know. Dad says we'll have to sell our house, move to an apartment. I'll probably have to transfer schools. They can't afford St. Ignatius anymore. You could apply for a scholarship, Lucy suggested. You're smart. Your presentations are always the best, even if they're about things that were never really mine. Victoria finished with a sad smile. Both girls looked at each other and, to their mutual surprise, shared a genuine laugh, perhaps their first real interaction since meeting. The moment was interrupted by Mr. Hart and Alexander approaching. There. You are, sweetheart, Mr. Hart said. We've been looking for you. Alexander studied the two girls with interest. I see you've found some common ground. That's good. Victoria stood awkwardly. I should go find my parents. Miss Montgomery, Alexander stopped her. Before you leave, I'd like to speak with you and your parents. I have a proposal that might interest you. Lucy glanced questioningly at her father, who gave a slight, knowing nod. That afternoon, in Principal Harris's office, the Montgomerys, Harts, and Alexander gathered. The proposal was simple yet life-changing. Mr. Hart needed someone to help manage Millbrook's agricultural modernization project, someone with financial experience. Despite his mistakes, Howard Montgomery had that expertise. It wouldn't be glamorous work, Mr. Hart explained. You'd get your hands dirty, learn the land, work directly with farmers. And you'd live in Millbrook, Alexander added. The project requires being hands-on. Howard Montgomery, his arrogance now replaced by humility, accepted gratefully. It was a chance to rebuild his life on solid ground, to redeem himself through honest work. For Victoria, the idea of moving to Millbrook was initially horrifying. But when Lucy offered to show her around, to help her adjust, something shifted. Perhaps it was the first time anyone had offered her real friendship without expecting anything in return. 6 months later, Millbrook had transformed. The agricultural project brought new opportunities. The renovated school shone at the town's center, and a small library donated by Alexander Pierce became a gathering place for young and old alike. Lucy continued at St. Ignatius, but now rode a school bus that picked up students from Millbrook and neighboring towns, all on scholarships from the new foundation. Victoria's change was most dramatic. The girl who'd once sneered at everything rural discovered an unexpected passion for botany, spending hours in experimental greenhouses, studying sustainable growing methods. She even began tutoring elementary students, uncovering a gift for teaching she'd never known she had. One evening, as Lucy and Victoria worked together on a science project about organic farming, Mr. Hart watched from a distance. Alexander Pierce, visiting Millbrook as he often did now, joined him. "Who would have thought those two would end up friends?" Alexander remarked. Mr. Hart smiled. "Life's full of surprises, old friend. Sometimes you need to lose everything to discover what really matters." "Speaking of surprises," Alexander said, "have you considered my offer? The VP position at Pierce Group is still yours. You could have that city office, live the life you've always deserved." Mr. Hart gazed at the sunset over the cornfields, breathed in Millbrook's clean air and shook his head gently. "My place is here, Alexander, always has been. Real wealth isn't in fancy offices or important titles. It's in waking up each morning, knowing exactly who you are and why you do what you do." Alexander nodded, finally understanding his friend's wisdom. At St. Ignatius, things had changed too. The Harts and Montgomery story became a living lesson about appearances versus authenticity. Inspired, Principal Harris implemented a social integration program where students from different backgrounds shared their experiences. Lucy and Victoria became symbols of this transformation, different in many ways, yet united by a lesson no textbook could teach, that true dignity comes not from what we own or pretend to be, but from the integrity with which we live each day. As the sun set over Millbrook, Lucy remembered her father's constant refrain. "Remember who you are and where you come from, and no one can make you feel small." Now she understood those words weren't just armor against cruelty, but a reminder that a person's true worth lies not in possessions, but in heart and actions.